Hey everyone. It's been commonly said that having a higher frame rate can make you better at games, especially shooters or rhythm games where reaction time and split-second decisions can make a big difference. And for those games, higher FPS absolutely has been proven to be beneficial. But in racing, not a lot of frame rate testing has been done, and some people argue that high frame rates don't matter as much or at all in racing games. So I'm here to put that to the test. There are still driving games today shipping at a locked 30 FPS, or with 30 FPS options. Forza Horizon 5 being likely the most popular, where even on the new Series X consoles, you have to play at 30 FPS if you want max graphics. So if you play racing games on a lower frame rate, it's time to find out if it's slowing you down. For this test, I will of course be in Horizon 5 here, running 10 laps of the Horizon Mexico circuit, a track I'm already very familiar with, in a B-Class car, and then a much faster S2 car. I'm going to rerun these 10 laps at 30, 60, and 120 FPS on my PC, with medium graphic settings to ensure super smooth and consistent frame pacing, so bear with me on the worst visuals in-game. Horizon 5 can look much better than this. The monitor is an Asus VG259QM with a refresh rate of 280Hz, and I'm using an Xbox Elite Series 2 controller to play. All settings will be equal between tests, besides of course the frame rate. I'm also going to run the higher frame rate tests first, just to make sure better times aren't simply a result of me having more practice on the track. The reason I'm running in B and S2 classes is to see if speed makes a difference. B class is pretty slow, so you don't need to react as quickly, but minor changes can still make a big impact. Whereas S2 class demands lightning quick response and smooth driving, especially on a track like this. So after warming up for a bit, I set out to get my 10 hot laps at 120 FPS in a B-Class Toyota Supra. I chose this car because, again, like the track, I'm really familiar with it, and being rear-wheel drive, even in B-Class, you still need to manage throttle and control oversteer. This, I feel, makes it a better test versus something like an all-wheel drive build where you can recover easier from mistakes and don't have to worry as much about precise throttle input. Now, I regularly play at 60 FPS, so at 120, the game looks and feels really smooth. You can tell even from moving the camera around the car that reactions just feel quicker. And in a race setting, quick adjustments to your line happen instantly, and you feel you can really trust the car. It honestly almost felt a bit too twitchy for me, as if I had to get used to the higher frame rate and responsiveness. So in the end, I managed to pull a time of 1:13.427 at 120 FPS. Then, running again at 60 FPS, the game still felt good. Of course, this is how I normally play. I had good control over my car, but as the laps continued to roll in, I continued to get more and more surprised. I just couldn't compete with my 120 FPS times, and ended up with a best lap of 1:13.610. We'll look at the full data very soon here. Finally though, at 30 FPS, the game felt pretty rough. However, about halfway through my test at lap 6, I started getting used to it and it felt more natural. Even though my laps felt pretty good, I could tell I was taking safer lines, braking earlier, and not managing my throttle as accurately. By the end, I had only managed a top time of 1:14.944. Now let's take a look at the fun bit, the full lap times chart. In red are my 30 FPS times. These are all sorted by time, by the way, not in actual lap order. Then green shows 60 FPS, and the blue is 120. This shows some fascinating results. I'm honestly shocked here. I went into this for one, not expecting really any difference between 60 and 120, and two, not expecting nearly as big of a gap dropping down to 30. But the results are clear, and again, if anything, these times are skewed to favor the lower frame rates, as I ran those after getting practice at the higher settings. Just for some more accuracy to see if perhaps fatigue was playing a role, immediately after finishing the 30 FPS test, I bumped things back up to 120 and set another hot lap at 1:13.877. right in the middle of my 120 FPS lap data. So these results are solid. Even in lower classes where I know the track and car well, higher frame rates can make a huge impact. First, let's look a bit deeper at the data between 60 and 120. You can see the mid-range times are fairly close, but on the low and high end, there's a pretty significant difference. The overall best lap difference is 0.183 seconds, which on a short track like this is actually a lot. That obviously adds up over a 3-lap race. The slower lap times also have a pretty big gap too, which shows to me that even though I still made mistakes at 120 FPS, I could recover from them much quicker. Now, the gap here to 30 FPS is massive. We're talking about a 1.5 second difference over the course of 1 lap on a short course. I felt like I was pushing the car as hard as I could, but it's clear that I just couldn't trust my inputs as much and couldn't react or correct as easily from my mistakes. Another point I want to show here is the difference between worst and best lap times within a certain frame rate. If we include all laps, my overall difference at 30 FPS is 1.37 seconds, and it's 1.4 at 60. At 120 FPS though, that difference goes down to only 1.18, about a fifth of a second closer together, which shows some more lap consistency at higher frame rates. Let's go ahead and remove the worst laps though, because as you can see on each run, I had one lap that was noticeably worse than the others. Here, the difference is 1.07 seconds at 30 FPS, 0.72 at 60, and 0.73 at 120. This data matches more closely with the rest of the chart, where at 30 FPS, my times were a lot less consistent, but at 60 and 120, I was able to put down more reliable lap times. I've got to say folks, going into this, I had no idea the data would be this clean and clear cut. I was just stunned when I put all the numbers in and saw this chart. Frame rate absolutely matters, and things get even more interesting when we look at our S2 car test. For this one, I picked the all-wheel drive Porsche 918. Based on feel, I had a pretty similar result. 120 FPS felt really smooth but a bit twitchy, and I had to get used to it, but once I did, the results spoke for themselves with a best lap of 52.016. At 60 FPS, I honestly felt a bit more comfortable with the car, but the lap times did not show that, with a best lap of 52.406 seconds. Finally, at 30 FPS, the experience again was rough. I had to vastly tame down my driving and play things much safer and slower. My best lap at 30 was 53.908. Let's pull up all the data again, and again it's obvious. I'm faster at higher frame rates. You can see here looking at the 30 FPS chart that there's a big gap here, but 6 out of the 10 laps were also pretty dang consistent. This is because if I did mess up, the cost was high. It's much harder to correct a mistake in an S2 car at 30 FPS, so I had to drive really smooth and well within my comfort limit to avoid sliding, underbraking, or missed apexes. That's why you see some really consistent times when I didn't mess up, but some really big outliers when I did. Again, the 120 and 60 FPS laps are much more similar, but there's an even more clear distinction between the two here at S2. My best laps at 60 and 120 differed by about 0.4 seconds, over twice the difference we saw in B class. And for what it's worth, in S2 I feel like I could have used more warm-up, as I was definitely learning a couple tricks throughout my 30 laps on the HMC. And if I were to run the 120 test again, I think the gap would be even larger. So for some other fun bits of data and some closing thoughts, I think we all could have predicted that 30 FPS would be a bit slower than 60, but I had no clue it would be this serious. And I'm shocked the improvements continue in real, measurable ways above 60 FPS as well. Here's a little thought experiment that helped me wrap my head around this all. At 30 FPS, the time in between frames is 33 milliseconds. At 60, it's 17, and at 120, it's only 8 milliseconds. Now, if you're traveling 120 miles per hour, you are traveling 175 feet in a single second. This means that at 30 FPS, you're only getting updates every 6 feet. which might not seem like a ton, but that's practically half a car length, and when it comes to precision driving, 6 feet is the difference between a perfect apex and going wide into a wall. In comparison, at 120 FPS, you're seeing a new frame every 1.5 feet at 120 miles per hour. This makes it much more clear that precision driving is way easier at higher frame rates and higher speeds, because instead of it taking 6 feet to notice your tires are starting to break loose, you can notice and correct that action within under 2 feet at 120 FPS. Another way to look at it is just with input times. Again, 33 millisecond frame timing at 30 FPS, 8 milliseconds at 120 FPS. That's a difference of 25 milliseconds of reaction time for each input. I recorded my controller inputs, and as it turns out, over the course of one lap, I made just over 130 controller inputs. That means any steering change, throttle, brakes, gear changes, etc. So if you spread a 25 millisecond reaction time difference over 130 inputs, that's over 3 seconds of total gained reaction time over the course of one lap. So again, I think it's clear why my 120 FPS time was nearly 2 seconds faster than 30 FPS. I just had more time to make inputs, and my reactions could be more precise and happen quicker. So folks, if you have the option to bump up your frame rate in your racing game, it's clear to me that if you want some free lap time gains, you should crank it up. I hope you enjoyed this video. This was really fun to make. I love doing nerdy deep dives into data like this, so let me know if there's anything else you want to see tested, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.